Hello, and welcome to Whale Hunting, where we shine a light on the hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Tom Wright, and this week we're looking at a story that dramatically escalated the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel back in September. I'm of course referring to the pager bombings, when thousands of pager devices exploded simultaneously across Lebanon in synchronized attacks. Today I'm joined by two of the Reuters reporters behind a fascinating investigation into how Israel's bulky pager fooled Hezbollah. Senior Correspondent Gauthier-Villars and Gebeily, Bureau Chief for Lebanon, Syria and Jordan. So hi Maya and David, thanks for joining us on Whale Hunting.
Thanks for having us.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Congratulations on your blockbuster story in Reuters from last month about the pagers. I'm just going to start by quickly giving a tiny recap of this story for the people who've been living under a rock and haven't heard about it. I'm sure most of the Whale Hunting listeners have heard about it. But obviously back on September the 17th, thousands of Hezbollah pagers exploded in Lebanon. Hezbollah obviously is the Iranian-backed militia that's fighting a war with Israel. And these pagers exploded. Somebody had put an explosive device at that time. Nobody knew exactly who it was. 39 people died, thousands more injured. I think some children died, but mainly Hezbollah militants died. And at the time, if I remember from just being a reader of this news, everybody thought that it was Mossad. What did you guys think? Obviously, Maya, you're there in Lebanon. David also covering this for Reuters. What did you think it was, Maya, at the time?
Well, I think given the context that we were in, this didn't really come out of nowhere. It wasn't like it was peacetime in Lebanon and these pagers just exploded. There had been almost a year at that point of back and forth exchanges of fire between the Israeli military and Hezbollah, mostly along Lebanon's southern border. So it was relatively contained. And so everybody interpreted it in that context. I mean, it was definitely a bit shocking. I can explain where I was if that helps. Where I was at the moment, I had a colleague who was on the way to meet a senior Hezbollah official. I was on a panel discussing climate change, and I was in the middle of, explaining that journalists have a very difficult time covering the important impacts of climate change when there's kinetic activity, when there's wars, when there's political turmoil, etc. in the country that you're in, even if climate is an important factor as well. And so she was calling me repeatedly. And she let me know, and she was calling me repeatedly, and she kept kind of urgently calling me, and I kept telling her, I just need 10 minutes to get off this panel. She just kept calling, and finally I excused myself from the stage and called her back, and she just kept screaming into the phone, the pagers are exploding. The pagers are exploding. And I said, I don't understand what you mean. And she said she witnessed, actually, Hezbollah members, because she was in the southern suburbs of Beirut, which is a Hezbollah stronghold, and she could see people walking around, and the next minute there were gaping holes in their hips. People had lost their hands, and it took a minute for people to understand what was happening, but it was quite quickly, within minutes, they kind of, they found that the common thread was really that all of these Hezbollah members had been carrying or wearing pagers that had all simultaneously exploded. So it was definitely a very unusual development in this conflict, but very quickly people interpreted it as part of what had been unfolding in Lebanon over the course of the year, which is Israel really trying to systemically dismantle Hezbollah's capabilities.
Now, I think just yesterday, Netanyahu admitted that he gave the go-ahead to this attack, but obviously back then in September, your journalists are trying to figure out exactly what happened. David, what did you immediately think this was Mossad, and then set about trying to investigate what happened? And how does a journalist go about trying to investigate something like this and find out how it led, how these pages were primed to blow up?
Because I live in Istanbul, in Turkey, I wasn't as close to the story as Maya. But in the first hours, the reports it was a bit confusing, because first it was a dozen pagers. It took a couple of hours to understand that it was the attack was on such a magnitude that it was just not just a dozen or 20 pager or so, that it was actually hundreds, and even we discovered later it was actually thousands. And you remember, maybe it's worth reminding listeners that there were actually two attacks, one on the 17th involving using pagers, and another one the next day on the 18th using walkie-talkies. It became pretty clear pretty quickly that it was only a state could have been capable of conducting an attack on this scale, and yeah, both Israel and the Mossad became prime suspect very quickly. We decided we wanted to understand how this happened. And by the way, I think I'd like to say something on how and it's about how the story was received. Actually, it's like after we published the story in October, many comments on social networks were actually quite negative because people accused us of condoning the attacks. And so for clarity's sake, let's make clear that we do not. We only sought to shed light on how this happened.
Well, having read the story, I have no idea how anyone came to that conclusion, so we can skip over that. So basically, your story has these bombshells. One is that it uses a stealthy design to be able to get, because pages are not big for younger listeners who don't remember pages. Actually, my first job as a trainee reporter was at Reuters, and I had a pager in the 90s, and they're used to beep you to tell you to go to a telephone. So they're not something that's really used very much in the world of mobile phones. So you're trying to figure out, okay, in your story from October, you show that they were able to get an explosive, plastic explosive in there and then detonate it. But how were they able, and how were they able to sort of get pages into the hands of thousands of Hezbollah militants, given that pages are not that used these days?
So this is a really interesting element also because in addition to some of the negative feedback we also got a lot of commentary that this was that after the pager attacks unfolded, that Reuters knew this was going to happen. And the reason that these accusations had come up is because months earlier in July we had written a story that my colleague and I had worked on for months about how Hezbollah was trying to counter Israel's high-tech surveillance. The Israelis have been able to basically just pick off Hezbollah members, some of them senior. I'm talking preceding the pager attack, so even before this latest wave. They had been able to pick off, from relatively senior commanders to even pretty low-level village officials within Hezbollah in the south with targeted drone strikes, some of them on their cars. Some of them were so precise that you could actually watch a video, for example, a CCTV footage of a street. A car would blow up, there would be a tuk-tuk or a passerby or somebody, and everybody else around them was fine. So the level of intelligence that they had about where these guys were, the cars they were driving, the apartments they were staying in was so high that it was creating a little bit of, it was creating pretty serious concerns within Hezbollah that they were already facing some kind of a breach. So their solution was drop the phones. No phones are allowed anymore in the battlefield. No fighters are allowed to take cell phones anywhere near the Israeli border. And even for some very senior officials, they were not allowed to have them anywhere south of Beirut itself. And instead, what we're going to use are pagers, because pagers are low tech. They cannot be hacked. This was the perception of Hezbollah at the time. They cannot be hacked, and we're going to distribute these pagers widely. So it's not just to fighters who are going to be on the southern front against Israel, but also members of the organization's other branches. They have medical services, they have organizational and kind of administrative branches as well. And so they distributed those pagers to thousands of members. And this happened starting around February. The reason that we can date this to then is because Hezbollah's slain Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah came out in a speech and said in February, these cell phones are so dangerous that you're wishing death upon yourself and anybody around you if you are a member of Hezbollah and you're carrying a cell phone.
Was it part of Mossad's plan from the get-go to target the cell phones and then target the people using the cell phones with drones to move them onto pages to then have the bigger attack?
This is a question that I think neither David nor I can answer, but it is a question that we've asked ourselves in the course of this reporting. Were these all parts of steering operations? So we steer Hezbollah away from the cell phones, we steer them towards the pagers, we blow up the pagers and force them to meet in person, and then we start, then they can start targeting group meetings. So it is
so we don't know that their success on targeting people via cell phones was part of a plan to get them to pages. But we do know, because of your reporting, that they planted the pages, and that was something very difficult, right, David? Because you had to create a whole fake supply chain for these things. Hezbollah are not idiots. They're not going to just take pages, thousands of pages from anybody. So this your reporting involves a Taiwanese company, a bona fide Taiwanese company that makes pages that had no idea. So can you just explain to our audience how this fake supply chain worked?
We started by looking at the design of the bomb, of how the bomb was planted inside the pager, and it actually informed us, and we're going to explain how it was made, but this design actually informed us on the sort of level of preparation by the Mossad, the attention to details. And so let's give an example. For instance, the Mossad appears to have known that Hezbollah would conduct due diligence, would inspect the devices, would try to trace their origin. And for instance, they apparently suspected that Hezbollah would check for against the presence of explosive inside the pager. And so they designed, we thanks to Maya, we had access to the photos of unexploded pager, and we could understand how the bomb was conceived. So the way they did it is they made sure that normally a detonator is contained in a small metallic capsule. And so that metallic capsule would have shown on X-ray. So they designed the detonator so that it wouldn't use any metal parts. And so if you put the battery and the device and the pager in an X-ray machine, you would not see anything. You would only see the battery cells. And actually, Hezbollah did conduct some checks. They did, according to Lebanese sources, they took the pages to an airport to put them in X-ray machines and check for against the presence of explosive, and they saw nothing. And they decided the pages were safe, and they started to distribute them quite widely. And to show how confident they were in those, they trusted those pages. Among the victims, there was even the Iranian ambassador to Lebanon, who appeared to. It is not. I actually don't remember, but maybe Maya, you know this. If it was his pager, or he was in the presence of a Hezbollah militant who carried a pager when he was wounded.
His eyes sustained some damage, so he was wounded in his eyes. And really, what we saw over the course of these attacks was that when somebody who was carrying a pager heard it beep, they to look at the message that was coming through, they held it up to their eyes. So I would be really surprised if he was looking at somebody else's pager. So the assumption is he picked up his own pager and was looking at it.
So to quickly recap what you said, they basically put a plastic explosive. They got a very thin amount of plastic explosive. They put it in between the battery packs. It wasn't picked up by the radars that they basically like an airport X-ray machine that they used, and so it was then distributed to thousands of people. Maya, how did and I want to get onto the reporting of this, which is phenomenal, by the way. But how did it explode? Did it explode on the first time that a message ever came in on the pager, and that was sent by Mossad, or did it work for a while? What triggered it?
The exact triggering mechanism also really baffled a lot of the experts that we spoke to, and even within Lebanon, the sources that we spoke to with intimate knowledge of, they had seen the pagers, they had examined them themselves. They couldn't figure out exactly what it was that was the exact trigger point. So there was something that was operated like a detonator. As David was saying, there was no metal component to it, so it wasn't picked up anywhere. So this still remains kind of up in the air for sources within Lebanon. And we did see that day the explosions taking place over the course of an hour. So they started around 3:30 p.m. local time, and people could still hear the kind of, these like series of blasts going off in Gauthier until 4:30. So over the course of an hour. So it wasn't a single moment in which they all simultaneously exploded. They came in waves. So some were at the stage of a first message, some were later on. I think David can also jump in on this question.
Well, we can on that point we should give credit to the Washington Post that also did a story on this pager attacks, and according to them, there were several mechanisms to trigger the explosions, and one of them was quite devilish because it involved you would receive an encrypted message, and to decipher it, to open the message, you had to press two buttons with your two thumbs. And so this was conceived to create maximum damage so that the user would get both hands wounded. And so that's one of the methods according to the Washington Post, through which the pages were activated.
I think something that people really like to hear is how do journalists do their work? Because we take it for granted what we do and how we find things out. But I think to a lot of people it seems like and this is a very difficult story to report. So you were able to get hold of, according to your story, you have a Lebanese source who we're not going to talk about who that is. I'm sure that's a protected person, but I'm imagining it's somebody very close to Hezbollah. And then you got hold of these photos, which I imagine Hezbollah had taken of a detonated pager at some point to try to figure out what the hell had happened. And that was the first sort of string you were able to pull to start to figure out all that was going on, right?
Yeah, I think the very first actually inklings that we had gotten about the construction of the pagers, and the first person that told us that there was a board of explosives, and he said board in Arabic, but really what we assume now that we understand he meant is probably a sheet of explosives. But he was saying there was basically a board of explosives that was somehow attached, integrated, etc., into the battery. This was a source who was very close to Hezbollah, who laid out in great detail to us the number of pagers that had been brought in, the number of pagers that exploded, the number of people that were wounded, the fact that they had thought they were buying it from the mother company, so they thought Hezbollah thought they were purchasing them from Gold Apollo. And ultimately, actually, it was a different source that offered us access to the photos and allowed us to see how the size, the placement, the way that they were concealed. But this was a very sensitive issue for Hezbollah, for Lebanese state security services, for other, for even for victims and families that were affected by this attack, because they really, it was on the one hand really shocking, and on the other hand, it really demonstrated how massive of a breach the Israelis had managed to, how deep basically they were able to penetrate Hezbollah's procurement networks. This wasn't just a kind of a remote intelligence operation in which they could install Pegasus onto someone's phone and start listening into their phone calls, things like that. It was something in which they had to have kind of physical access, and they were able to penetrate those physical procurement processes.
Well, let's get into the procurement. You mentioned this company Apollo just now, so let's talk about that. So, how did they manage to create these fake websites and this whole fake supply network of these pages from this Taiwanese company that really does make pages, but didn't make these, right? How are they able to get those pages sort of onto that company's website to make it look like it was to do with that company, so that then Hezbollah was not so concerned and was more willing to buy them? How did that all play out?
Let's make clear that the company in Taiwan did not make the weaponized pager. They were made by Israeli agents, and most likely inside Israel, because from what we understand, Israel didn't want to move around those explosive, those batteries laden with explosive. This is not something you would want to move around. Send them to China and back to Lebanon. The Mossad needed to create backstories to give credibility, verisimilitude to that device, to those. They needed Hezbollah to accept the idea that those were genuine pagers. So they did two things. For the pagers themselves, they signed a license agreement with a well-known pager maker called Gold Apollo in Taiwan. And so what they did is they created a number of shell companies in Eastern Europe, and one of those companies signed the license agreement. So the company in Taiwan thought that it was dealing with just an Eastern European pager distribution company. And initially, the agreement was just to distribute pagers. And then at some stage, they introduced a new idea. They said, oh, actually, we would want to make our own design. Could we use your brand? And the Taiwanese company accepted. So thanks to that agreement, they could put the label of Gold Apollo, a well-known manufacturer, on their own design. But they had another problem, which is that the battery did not exist on the market. And so they needed to also create a backstory for that battery because they assumed that Hezbollah would check. And so what they did is they created a website where they described the battery. They had a YouTube video that praised its performance, and they created 2 online shops, one in Canada and one in China, where you could buy spare batteries. At least that's what the e-commerce shop claimed. And they also they went as far as creating discussions on forums devoted to battery about this particular model. So there's a dialogue from 2022, which took place months before the pagers were sent to Hezbollah. They created an online dialogue between 2 users of that battery forum, and one saying, for instance, "Oh, I have found this battery. It's strange because it doesn't have a brand. It doesn't have a brand name." And another user on the forum says, "Oh, but I know this battery well. I know this product. It has great performance. It's not unusual at all for a battery not to have a brand." And so this is the kind of thing the Mossad created online to make sure that should the Hezbollah conduct some, should they just Google the reference of the battery, they would find something. As a former Israeli spy put it, if you want to make sure that if they look, they find something. You not finding anything is not good. The person said.
Right, and that was 2 years before the delivery in February of this year to Hezbollah.
Months before, not 2 years. Yeah, a few months before the delivery.
So do you have a sense? Do you have a sense of, I mean, how long in the making something like this was for Mossad?
We don't know exactly when they launched it. Apparently the walkie-talkies were sent to Hezbollah years before, sometimes around 2015, 2016. The pagers were sent, as we reported, were sent in February of this year. And we are finding traces, be it online websites, those conversation on the battery forums, or creation of those shell companies as far back as late 2021, early 2022.
So Maya, you're sitting there in Beirut, and just before we started recording, you were saying you can hear the sounds of the warfare. Can you tell us what you think this intelligence operation, what impact it will have on Hezbollah?
It's a good question, and it's very difficult to answer because it really began. I mean, I was joking with some other journalist friends yesterday, and we were referring to everything, BP and AP before the pagers and after the pagers, because everything about covering the conflict has changed starting September 17th. Really, what we were covering before then was a relatively low level, kind of steady pace, maybe sometimes escalating, sometimes de-escalating, with some notable moments and notable commanders that were killed. Up until September 17th, that's the conflict that we were covering. After September 17th, things really, really dramatically changed because the nature of the attacks changed, and the types of commanders and the types of senior figures within Hezbollah were radically different, that were killed were just of a different caliber. Hassan Nasrallah's last speech on September 19th was to address the pager attacks, and he talked about how it was it was the most serious blow that the organization had been dealt in its history, that it was unprecedented, and that this was something that they would have to investigate and address within the inner circle of Hezbollah. That was his last speech, September 19th. On September 26th, Friday, 27th, Friday of the following week, he was killed in a very intensive bombing spree on the southern suburbs of Beirut. And so that was all in one period. That was all kind of in the span of just 8-9 days. There was so much that changed for Hezbollah during that period. Its comms equipment was completely, was just not safe to use. A lot of the figures that we had been speaking to, that had been sources, were either not online or had been killed themselves in some of these strikes as well. So it became increasingly difficult for people who wanted to understand what was happening to the organization to really get credible, detailed information without having to go through, several layers of it's a second or third tier piece of information. So it became difficult for the organization itself to communicate. It also became more difficult for journalists to continue reporting on Hezbollah in the way that they had been prior to those attacks.
But does it deal a death blow to Hezbollah in any way?
It really was the first. It was the first episode of a series of significant blows to the organization. So again, it hit the telecoms. It hit what they thought was their solution to the intelligence breach, and that ended up completely backfiring.
But can they continue to be a existential threat to Israel? Is what I'm getting at.
We've seen them continue to fire rockets across the border, including 150 kilometers deep into Israeli territory, including rockets that are fired from further away from the border. So what they're trying to demonstrate and what they consider to be their kind of source of strength in all of this, and their demonstration of the fact that they can keep going, is the fact that they continue to fire mid-range missiles at Israeli positions within Israel, and they continue to push back Israeli forces that are seeking to make progress in their ground incursions into Lebanon. So from Hezbollah's perspective, they've actually really managed to reconstitute themselves to, under very difficult circumstances, set up a new command and control structure that has allowed them to continue to fight at a pace that is, in their view, enough to pose some kind of deterrent threat to Israel. I think one of the things that we had heard from one of the sources within Hezbollah that we had been speaking to was that if Hezbollah had completely crumbled, and if that command and control structure had completely crumbled, then you would have seen Hezbollah fighters just completely lose control of the pace of operations with which they've been carrying out these strikes. As in, they would have started to use their extremely heavy missiles. They would have started to be very non-strategic about what they're hitting. And actually, what we've seen them do is continue to maintain a certain level of that kind of calibration that they've been trying to do for the last year in terms of which targets they strike, why they strike them, when they strike them, what weapons they use, etc. And they consider that they're actually able to demonstrate that not only can they continue to fight and continue to fire rockets at Israel, but they're doing it in a way that means they haven't completely lost that command and control structure.
And just finally, David, I mean, you mentioned earlier that you gotten some criticism for this reporting. Obviously, the Israel-Gaza war and then this war, there's huge pressure on journalists to try to be neutral, and very difficult job you're doing at this time. I think this attack, because it attacked pages and it booby-trapped basically an everyday item. These fighters were carrying them into markets and stuff. That's one reason people got so emotional about it, right? Do you think this is signaling a change in the way that warfare can be conducted? I mean, we did a podcast at Project Brazen about the sound, which is the attacks using radio waves on U.S. Spies in Havana, otherwise known as Havana syndrome. There's these kinds of warfare by other means. We're long got the battlefield warfare's long gone. Drones have been around for a long time, but now we've got this new sort of relatively new, I guess, way of conducting warfare. Do you think that's something we're going to see more of?
Yes. So it is not the first time someone planted explosives in an electronic devices. Can point to the attack against Mossad in Afghanistan in 2001. It was journalists. Al-Qaeda operatives posing as journalists who detonated bomb hidden in their camera. And actually we found that in 1999, several Israeli agents were wounded when they analyzed a cell phone seized from Hezbollah, and that contained explosives, and that blew up in the laboratory. They were analyzing the cell phone in a lab, and they didn't check for the presence of explosives. They were hoping to find intelligence on Hezbollah, and the device blew up. So, but yeah, it's a good point that it's this attack using so many pagers is different and could herald the new a new era when governments feel that they can use this non-conventional tactic.
Well, it's fascinating and it's, I should say, scary, I guess. David and Maya, congratulations on a fantastic story. Maya, stay safe in Beirut, and I'm looking forward to reading what else you report from Reuters. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having us, Tom.
Thanks so much, Tom. Thank you.
That's it for this week, and thanks to Maya and David for joining us. To read their full investigation, head to Reuters.com or search online for How Israel's Bulky Pager Fooled Hezbollah. Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean, Claire Urban, and Arnav Binaikia. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, and Charlie Barlow is associate producer. Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.